Kumar, joining you from northern India, Bihar, where I live with my partner Abhishek, our 2 children, and my in-laws. Today's topic is learning a new language and culture without losing yourself. I want to start a little bit with story time and why I want to share about this topic. When I was 23, I moved to India. I moved for work, but I accepted the position because I was very interested in India. My father was an international business person, and I was up for the challenge, really. So that was 16 years ago, and now I'm here living in northern India, and people often tell me that, oh, you've become so Indian. Aap to bahut Indian ban gaye ho, aap to Bharati ban gaye ho. But what they really mean is not that I've actually become Indian. It means a little bit of something else. So let's dive in. When I first moved to India as a young, impressionable, fresh out of college 23-year-old, I had this idea that I was going to go and learn a new language and just kind of turn the world upside down. I was going to build my resume and I was going to, reinvent myself as a young person and learn all about the world and make some impact in the business world. I was joining an IT company at that time, and I was also involved in a little bit of volunteer work on the side. And I just had these kind of notions that as an American, I wanted to, I was almost doing a favor to the local people by learning their language or by being a part of their culture. And oh, how wrong I was. My language learning experience was very much immersion based. So I wasn't necessarily doing a class, it was a program where it was an immersive experience. So I would go, and my goal was to just talk to people as much during the day as I could. I would have different projects that I would do where I would go and learn certain phrases and words, where I would go and practice those throughout the day. I would have a lesson with a local person, and I would just listen to different phrases. I would say, okay, I want to learn how to say, how are you? How much does this cost? What is your name? Different things like that. They were kind of basic parts of the, most languages. And then I would go and practice those things at home. Later on in the day, then I would go out and speak those things 10 times, 15 times to whomever, and then see what the reaction was. So this was also part of what's called a GPA, the growing participant approach. And I think that's a fantastic approach for language learning. But it is also kind of one of those things where it forces you to completely adapt and put yourself in a learning position. It doesn't allow you to kind of remain in this intellectual box or a book kind of setting where you're breaking down the language grammatically. It really forces you to be in and living the language, which particularly for Hindi, which is what I was learning at the time, was very much required. Many languages in South Asia, I think, are best learned by the immersive experience about living with people, learning the cultural nuances, spending time with native speakers. There are many apps, there are so many different programs that you can do online, which those can help, but there's nothing that can replace that immersive experience. And that does require you to really put yourself in kind of a different world. So for me, at those beginning phases, I definitely went through this experience of kind of totally immersing myself and putting these expectations on myself that I needed to learn everything. I needed to completely delve into the culture. I would barely call friends and family back home. I was told by my supervisor, for 6 months, really just try not to speak English. So I think with that, of course, you're going to feel that, you are disconnected a bit from yourself and a bit from your roots. And I think that's fine, but of course, there can be dangers in that as well. India is one of those places particularly where a lot of people end up to find themselves in some way. Or, if you watch Eat, Pray, Love, India is one of these, exotic places where people kind of wander around and go to an ashram and go to do yoga. Maybe some of you have also been here and done some of those things. And there's this expectation of, in the midst of the chaos and in the midst of just how completely opposite it is from our Western civilization, that there's something to be found, there's something to be grasped, there's something that we can take away from the experience. And I think that's definitely true, but things can also kind of turn south if we're not careful. India is definitely one of those places where this whole losing yourself can happen very easily. The constant pressure to conform to societal standards, to be uniform, and be, particularly if you're married to a person of Indian origin, or if you want to live there for a long time, if you're working, or if you're kind of a part of the community in some intimate way, the pressure to become Indianized is very, very strong. And one of the favorite thing for Indians to do, in my experience, is to like Indianize new foreigners who are here for the experience. So it's not uncommon to get dressed up in a sari, and for local friends to kind of doll you up if you're a female, or for I think a lot of people feel very flattered in India when foreigners take on their culture with respect and allow them to kind of fuss over you a bit, to Indianize you, at least from the external point of view. So in this whole process of becoming Indian, which we'll talk about dismantling that later, it almost subconsciously can become a goal. There are these questions of, do you like spicy food? Or do you know how to wear a sari? Do you speak Hindi, Punjabi, Gujarati, whatever, insert language into that blank. And if you don't, there's a polite but yet slightly disappointed look that comes over the face of the local person, like, oh, okay. And you feel this sense of that you're not like a good enough foreigner. So how do you remain yourself while also learning and adapting to a new culture as powerful and as intoxicating as India? For example, when I was living in northern India as a young person, I often felt this pressure where people would ask me constantly, "Aap shaadi kab kar rahi ho? When are you getting married? Aap Indian se shaadi karogi? Are you going to get married to an Indian? Or aap khana banati ho? Do you make, what kind of Indian food do you make?" All these kind of questions where really I was working there, I was living there, but my goal wasn't initially necessarily to completely enculturate myself in Indian culture. However, that seemed to be kind of the expectation from others around me. And there's one moment that I can particularly think of, after so much pressure from the outside of, wear the clothes and do the dance and make the food and learn the language and all of these things, I had a breakdown. It was on my birthday. I believe it was my 24th or 25th birthday. And some of my friends had come over to my house, and we were getting ready. So I had my outfit, I was putting on my makeup, and I was getting dressed. Where I was living is Haridwar, which is in the northern part of India, kind of near Rishikesh, but it's a place where mostly locals live. Not so many foreigners are there, especially 15 years ago when I was there. So people weren't necessarily used to foreigners, neither did they need to be. It was their country. I was there as a guest. Back in the early 2000s, we had this kind of like wavy hairstyle with, you kind of gel it and then kind of just scrunch it, what we used to call scrunching, and then you could just kind of pin it up in the messy hair. So I definitely had that hairstyle, and that hairstyle is not popular in India, especially at that time, and people just thought it was the grossest thing. And these girls would always tell me, oh, you need to brush your hair. So I was putting up my hair and kind of getting ready for the party, and this girl literally took a comb and started brushing my gelled hair. And like, "Nee, you need to brush it, you need to brush the hair." And she started pulling my hair to brush. And I just felt like enough is enough. Like, I'm not gonna conform anymore. I'm gonna be me. I don't need to go along with this any longer. And I just said, "Ab ruk jaiye. मुझे छोड़िए, मुझे अकेला छोड़िए, just leave my hair, please don't mess with my hair. And so I think that was a breaking point for me to realize that what are my motivations here? Why am I actually trying to learn Hindi? And why do I feel the pressure to completely become Indian, wear the clothes, have the hairstyle, eat the food? So I needed to examine a little bit deeper what my motivations were and why I reacted so harshly against someone that was just going along with the messages that I had kind of conveyed to enculturate myself. So if you're going to be immersing yourself in a new culture, a new language, how can you prevent these things from happening, like what happened to me? Number one is, I would say, you kind of, in a sense, can't escape the mess of language learning. It will be messy, it will be chaotic. But I think it really depends on getting the right motivations and understanding your motivations from the beginning. I guess I should correct that. There's no one right motivation for learning a language, but I think understanding what your true motivations are can be really helpful to having the best experience possible. So, number one, understanding your true motivations. You might not actually have to express those once you realize them, but locals will figure it out pretty quickly once you get into relationship and start the learning process. I think, of course, it's always a good thing to have a high view or a positive view of the culture from which you're trying to learn. I think that's mostly a pretty natural thing. I can't necessarily think of a lot of circumstances where someone would have a negative view and then want to spend years of their life to learn and enculturate into a place. But really having a high view of the culture and a high view of the people from whom you're trying to learn, I think is a critical first step. So what would some possible motivations be? Would it be to find acceptance in a new culture? Would it be to find yourself, which we've already talked about? Is it to try and help people? Are you working with some kind of a nonprofit organization, or are you in some kind of community where there's a lot of need and you have a specific skill set which can serve the people where that's not being met currently by the local economy? Are you trying to learn a new language to build your resume? Nothing wrong with that. It's just good to know. Or do you have a love interest in that other culture whom you're trying to impress or get to know their family? For me, I had a combination of all of those at different points in my journey. So it's just good to know kind of where your motivations are and then aligning your learning experience with those motivations. Number two, of course, I think we need to talk about decolonizing the language learning process. For me personally, as a white female living in northern India, in regions where there are really not many foreigners, I've been confronted quite often with white privilege, with the post-colonial kind of lull and assumptions about white people, Americans, white females in particular. So I think understanding those core misunderstandings in the beginning and going in with that knowledge is incredibly helpful to whatever culture that you're going to be learning about. Sometimes, as a newbie in a new culture, you will be asked to do strange things. Story time. I was quite new in India at the time, and I think I had been around a year and a half in northern India, and I was visiting an orphanage in Kolkata. Some local friends of mine had invited me around Christmas time, and they said, you can help with the Christmas program. We're doing all these things. So going in knowing that I was going to be with a bunch of locals and the single white person, I, of course, underestimated the amount of spotlight and attention that was going to be on me. Foolishly, I didn't realize how much of an effect that would have on the program and the work that these folks were trying to do. Christmas pageant started, and one of the leaders asked me, Jessica, would you please help us and dress up like Mrs. Claus. You can do some entertainment for us. The kids will love it. It will be fantastic. So stupidly, I thought, this is one of the leaders. I probably shouldn't let her down. It would be kind of funny. I'm fine doing silly things. I don't mind. Then things got weird. I dressed up like Mrs. Claus. I walked down the aisle. I did, we all sang some Christmas songs, things like that. Then it was time to pass out the Christmas gifts. And instead of having the local leaders give out the gifts in some kind of a systematic way, they appointed me as Mrs. Claus to go and throw out Christmas gifts from a large bag. Now, if you know anything about India, there's some very strange colonial history, and especially when it comes to the damage that the British have done in India, there's some very strange feelings about, white people and like giving and overgiving and kind of dependencies that are created, especially even by nonprofit organizations and things like that. So it is a very sensitive issue to, as a white person, just be going out into some area, like throwing out money and gifts. It's actually incredibly harmful. And so even though these weren't my gifts to give, they had me pass them out. I felt very weird about this, but I was already kind of halfway down the slide at that point, and I went along with it. Being put on a pedestal like that made me feel very strange, and yet I realized that I was not being myself, but I was playing the part of some white individual that had been glorified without even having to earn that position. What I should have done was decline and taken a back seat and said, okay, I'll dress up like Mrs. Claus and just sit there and, you guys lead it. This is your orphanage. You're the ones that are doing the work. You're the ones that know these kids. You should be the one to pass out the gifts. You should be the one to take the credit, to lead the songs, to do this. I can sit there and they can take pictures with me and whatnot. I was the token foreigner and I went along with it, and when I really shouldn't have. So I should have declined, taken a back seat, rather than allowing myself to be used as a token. In these cases, it's easy to blame the locals and say, well, they're the ones that made me do it. I didn't know. I think this happens more than you would think, and I think you really need to be cognizant of some of these things as a foreigner, saying that I may be asked to do some things that are a bit strange, and it's always better to remain on the safe side rather than kind of fulfilling this role of a token foreigner in some sense to accomplish something I may not even be aware of. You may also be asked to do things which really don't fit your values. And for me, of course, this was an example of me kind of losing myself. I would never want to support this kind of white saviorism, the concept that I'm here giving out all these toys as a white person, as a Mrs. Claus figure, and when really the locals are the ones that have done all the work and know these kids. But because I was kind of in the whole wanting to please people and wanting to be culturally sensitive when it was actually ignorance, I ended up perpetuating a harmful stereotype. So it was really my responsibility, even as the guest, to be aware of that ahead of time. All right, number 3, we got to talk about white privilege. It has a lot to do with the language learning process. And even if you are a person who is a person of color, or you're going to somewhere where if you are a white person and you're in a white community, I think we still need to be aware of some of these things. So acknowledging the fact that it does exist. Myself being a white female who has learned fluent Hindi in India, I get a lot of undue attention, or maybe there's some due attention, but not the amount that I give, so that I receive. So if somebody from South India who has little to no knowledge of Hindi comes and learns fluent Hindi, they will not be praised a tenth of the amount that I will be praised as an American white person having learned Hindi. If a Latinx person or a Korean person comes to learn an Indian language, there will be very little praise given because they kind of may appear to look more Indian, in a sense. So even though they had just as many barriers to learn the language that I did, because of the way that I look and because I'm a white person, I get more praise, more accolades, more attention, more social media followers than anyone else. So there are definitely ways to abuse this privilege of taking the space of Indian people who have the ability to speak on a topic. And I think this applies to any culture. So if you're a foreigner and you've learned a new language, people will often put you on a pedestal rather than actually listening to their own local people about what these unrelated topics to language learning. So I think we have to be really careful not to dive into things which aren't relevant to our topic. It's always good to uplift local people, uplift native speakers, and remember your place as a guest in the culture if you are learning about this new culture and language. Of course, if you're not a white person, or if you are a different ethnicity from the place that you're going to be living, you might want to kind of discover ahead of time what preconceived notions or prejudice may be there. Again, I'm going to use an example from India. One of my pals was from Virginia, and she's an African-American woman. We were both young, the same age, and several of us were all living in northern India, working at the time. This woman had a white roommate who both were beautiful girls by any beauty standard. Both of these girls were like, absolutely gorgeous. And however, the way they were treated in India was very, very different. My one friend who was white would often get a lot of praise. People would sit and look at her and stare at her and talk to her. And this other woman who is African American, in her own words, when people would look at her, would kind of say, "That's different." So it was almost like they wanted to be the white woman and the black woman was just different. So kind of understanding those prejudices or those kind of misconceptions ahead of time will really help you in being able to navigate the language learning process and navigating your place, how you fit, and how you can make the most of your language learning experience. You have to know too that people are conditioned to behave a certain way around foreigners, and you have to fight that. So people may expect you to use the language in some way to benefit yourself, or if you're just trying to learn for your own good. If you really just want to go learn the language without taking anything, if you really want to give back, if you're a member of the community, I think people will realize that. Just be careful though not to, again, get put up on a pedestal or kind of take a position of power, especially in a place if there are racial dynamics at play. The last point, number 4, is practicing cultural humility. Of course, cultural intelligence and cross-cultural knowledge is something that we all desire, but it is fine and it is actually praiseworthy not to know everything. To say, "I don't know." To say, "I'm not sure about that. Can you teach me?" Or asking questions. When we make a mistake, breaking down those assumptions that you may have, apologizing, admitting that you were wrong. This is an incredibly important part of language learning that I would fair to say that you can never become fluent in a language without cultural humility, without allowing yourself to be corrected over and over, and without apologizing, owning your mistakes, and continuing forward with love and respect for the culture that you're going into. So in conclusion, I think there are some things that we do need to lose when we're going through a cultural acclimation. And there are plenty of ways that we can prevent from entirely losing ourselves, losing our personality, becoming someone that we're truly not. And sometimes it does take some time. It does take mistakes. It does take a lot of learning and sometimes many, many years. So I just encourage all of you to continue on the road of language learning and forging into new territories. I did want to share my podcast, which is called the Invisible India Podcast. We talk a lot about cross-cultural elements and some of these elements of language learning. I do talk a lot about Hindi learning process that I've been through, South Asia in particular. We also talk about cross-cultural relationships, some of the dynamics of being in a cross-cultural or interracial, interfaith relationship. The show also talks quite a bit about some of these principles of white saviorism and volunteerism, doing more harm than good as a foreigner in a new culture. If you work in the nonprofit sector or in any way, I do have a couple of episodes talking particularly about some of these topics. I do welcome Q&A. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person or live to accept the Q&A, but let's do it on social media. Let's do it on email. You can write to me on social media, and we, of course, using the Burning Man hashtags. I'll be watching from here in India and participating that way. So feel free to @ me. My tag on most of my social media is Invisible India on Instagram. And of course, I'm on YouTube. On Twitter, I'm India Invisible. On Facebook, India Invisible. You can also look me up on LinkedIn. My name is Jessica Kumar. My show can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and basically everywhere that podcasts can be found. I appreciate all of you listening. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the experience at Burning Man. I wish I could be with you. Let's connect on social media.